One more other thing. I got to have an extremely interesting conversation about fish sauce with the guys over at Unchefed. So if you want to hear me blather on about food even more and with other people, go check them out. You can find Unchefed on Good Pods and everywhere else you get your podcasts. Just a quick note. The Intelligent Speech Conference is back for its 4th year. This year, the theme is crossings. It's Saturday, June 25th, and is a one-day, intense online extravaganza that focuses on independent educational podcasts, a veritable 3-ring circus of edutainment from your own comfy chair. Tickets are available at intelligentspeechconference.com. Tickets are $30, but $20 if you pick up early bird tickets before June 1st. And if you use my promo code FOOD, that's an extra 10% off for you. All the info will be in the description box as well. I hope to see you there. Episode 46. Corn is American now. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be looking at corn, the builder of empires, the mother of civilizations as it traveled across the North American continent. At first glance, it looks like it was flattened by contact with the Europeans and reduced to a disappointment and food of the poor and last resort. But it turns out I was wrong. To find out how, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is this is one of those episodes where I thought I knew what I was going to do when I wrote the next week blurb based on a cursory skim of my materials for this week. But when I sat down with all the notes and started to put the pieces together to get a whole picture, I realized I had missed some important things. Yes, in the 19th century and beyond, corn will become a food for the poor that causes a whole host of problems and reinforces the idea that the poor are automatically the carriers of disease and need to be shunned. But corn never stops being the builder of empires. It's the how that changes. Corn built civilizations and monuments that are still being found. Many of the structures that were built were so large that it took aerial and later satellite photography to make many of them visible. Many were so big we couldn't see them until we could view them from the air. While stone pyramids are the ones we all learn about, they're cool, they're stunning, they're mind-boggling, and, big sigh, inspire people to discount the imagination, ingenuity, and organization of earlier civilizations, and they come up with truly bonkers time travel and alien flights of fancy. But more common, and often more impressive once they are identified, are the earthen mounds built all over the Americas, North, South, and Central. For while you can put a pile of rocks somewhere and short of glaciers or epic flooding, it isn't going to go anywhere. But earthen mounds, especially those in use in temperate and tropical climates, so subject to packing, erosion, and shifting, required not just building labor, but also maintenance, something we are discovering in our own rearrangement of the landscape with levees, roads, coastal neighborhoods, and port cities. North America had several groupings of mound-building civilizations, and I had never heard of them until I was an adult, while teaching elementary school kids about art and researching Maya Lin, the artist responsible for the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. She began her career by building sculptures that echoed the monuments and ground shaping created by the Native Americans gathered within the moniker of mound builders or Mississippian culture that had previously inhabited the Ohio landscapes she was born and grew up around. The earliest mounds have been dated to around 3,500 BCE and were still to be found in use and described by the 16th century Spanish party led by Hernán de Soto. Pyramidal mounds, multi-layered and reinforced, were used as burial sites and temples. The Serpent Mound structure in southern Ohio is just about 1,300 feet long. That's a little over 4 American football fields, or around 400 meters. It's the connection of a spiral, a serpentine line, and intentional shapes, and dated to when a supernova was visible in the daylight sky at the end of the first millennium CE. And they think it had to do with celestial phenomena because it was also built on an ancient meteor impact site. The mounds could also be used as defensible villages that would be surrounded by rivers or for other purposes such as watching fields or simply raising the sleeping and social areas out of the hottest, muggiest, and buggiest air. Anyway, I'll include some basic links and images about this whole wild area of American history that is mind-boggling for its length, intricacy, widespread presence all over the continent, and its utter invisibility in most U.S. history curriculum. In other words, there were pyramids here the whole time in the U.S. I was growing up in, and nobody told me? I just find that unsatisfying. Anyway, the earliest monumental structures in North America seem to predate corn, but not sunflower seeds. More on that in a later episode. But the larger village-sized mounds that were of practical use were absolutely built and used in concert with corn culture. And all of that is there to explain what I meant by builder of monumental structures. Not just the Incan Great Temple at Cusco, or the palace at Machu Picchu, or the Aztec pyramids of the sun and the moon, and the city built over the lake at Tenochtitlan that is now the site of Mexico City, but the monuments built all over what is now the U.S., and that many of them were made possible by corn. For corn was a form of storable wealth. The practice of parching and the practice of lye, cal, or other basic treatment made for a uniquely storable grain. It wouldn't sprout, and the alterations to water content and its pH made it uniquely resistant to rot. It could be cached or placed into long-term storage to defend against drought, grasshopper plagues, and other food disasters to fend off famine. And it could be traded in times of plenty. It ably formed the base of the food of the masses, providing adequate calories and nutrients, with only the barest addition of other plant foods. It was brewed into lightly alcoholic beer, and it was useful as a travel food. Different varieties were eaten small in the spring, fresh and sweet in the summer, and provided a bounty in the fall, and because it stored well, would fill bellies during empty winters. All of this variety, in concert with other native plants, made corn the foundation of many North American pre-Columbian societies. So when the 17th century colonists stumbled hungry on the eastern shore of the soon-to-be British colonies, they found both life-saving caches of corn and villages of healthy people who had food to spare and later trade for. They would live off this corn successfully enough to plant their own roots and lay down the foundations for the 18th century society. Corn would be grown to make bread, disappointing English bread, beer, bad beer by English reckoning, and create daily mushes and stews. So I was on track that corn was flattened in variety and scope at European encounter. It was regarded as a poor substitute for real food. Varieties were mainly selected for bulk and plenty, rather than variety and possibility. For in the 17th and the 18th century, corn would mainly be domestic food. It would feed workers, free, indentured, and enslaved, while they grew cash crops to be sent back to the center of the empire. Wheat to make bread and ship's biscuit, rice to grace the tables of the wealthy in London, tobacco to be smoked by the literary and party set. Corn-fed pigs were salted and soon smoked to make American hams. Cows overwintered on corn stalks to be ready to produce spring milk for American cheeses and butter. Cod fishermen went out with cornmeal to make mushes, and the processors gutting and salting the cod for return to Europe and sending south to the sugar islands also ate corn. And of course, the captured Africans and their enslaved children were eating corn mushes while they produced sugar, indigo, and coffee, along with the other diversifying cash industries of the Caribbean. Not to mention all the workers, indentured and enslaved, mining iron and roughly processing it for further working back in Britain. So corn was changed. Instead of corn building civilizations that grew, consumed, and husbanded the corn itself, it was transformed into a fuel to run the engine of empire. Back in Britain, corn was seen as a thing grown over there in the New World in order to make the importation and manufacture of profitable, valuable, marketable products for the empire over here. As a result, for quite a while, and for a huge selection of people, corn was simply seen as a substitute for real food. But if there's one thing that always happens when people have too much of something and are given even the smallest of chances, they will innovate. In the 18th century, that time had come. So let's take a look at how the people who were faced with the job of making food day in and day out, and how they started to move beyond the denigrated corn mush and succotash of the 17th century and developed 3 new, uniquely American things that were a result of the cooking knowledge of Northwestern Europe and Central West Africa, mixed with food products of North America and the products of the Caribbean. The first international dish is Indian pudding. Now mostly relegated to history cooking projects, it seems like a unique dish when we observe it from the present. It was fine or medium ground cornmeal boiled with milk. Optionally, eggs could be beaten in, and it was sweetened with molasses, and sometimes it had spices added. But this American adaptation is just a midpoint between the flummery of the late Middle Ages and the Jell-o instant pudding you can grab off the grocery shelf today. Prove it, you say? Well, first of all, let me describe flummery. It is a sweet made by soaking oatmeal, usually. Sometimes other grains are used. The starch in the grains was completely hydrated by soaking it in water for up to 3 days. The incredibly soggy oats were then boiled to make a wobbly mass, and then sweetened and eaten with cream or fruit or sweetened wine sauces. With the rise of sugar, dedicated sweets, where the bulk of the dessert was fairly flavorless to show off the sugar and rosewater or other spices, were becoming all the rage in 18th century middle-class homes. As there was more money to go around, oat flummery that still had some texture from the oat grains, it was replaced by smooth gels made by isinglass and hartshorn. These are both gelling agents that didn't require the effort of calf's foot. And better yet, each could exist in the pantry in their dried state, just waiting to be reconstituted. Isinglass was the dried swim bladders of a variety of fish, mainly sturgeon and later cod. In the modern age, the swim bladders of other fishes are used, and its main purpose is for clarifying beer. But fish bladders and isinglass has had many lives, and in the 18th century, it was as a gelling agent for wobbly desserts. Hartshorn was the shavings of deer horns. The showiest young male buck deers are also known as harts, thus hartshorn. These boiled slivers and slices of deer antler would be set at a low boil for a few hours until they gave up their gelatin. Like isinglass, hartshorn also shows up many times in different ways, and we'll see it again when it's time to talk chemical leavening and smelling salts. At this point, these flummeries, whether oatmeal, isinglass, or hartshorn, were just spoonable, softly gelled concoctions, close in consistency to modern pudding. But they were also precursors to wobbly British jellies and American Jell-o that will come to signify fancy class in the 19th and early 20th century, but become kitchen kitsch by the end of the 20th. In the North American colonies, wind and water mill ground cornmeal was used to make similar sweet puddings to flummery. Indian pudding appears in that very first Amelia Simmons cookbook. They were far less work than flummery because ground corn doesn't have all the internal structure that oatmeal and other grains do, and the starch of ground corn is easier to release than from oatmeal. So the wobbly, soft texture was easier to achieve with just an hour or 3 of boiling and some vigorous stirring. Though coarser grinds of meal might simmer away in a cloth and basin for 12 hours to achieve the desirable wobbly texture. Isinglass and hartshorn were largely unused by the 18th century colonial cook because they required imports for isinglass or labor for the hartshorn, and the 18th century colonists preferred to save those things for for stuff they couldn't find substitutes for. Now, as a nation, we were so fond of this Indian pudding concoction, it was eventually developed and refined into the modern Jell-o pudding. If you look at the ingredients on the box, they are sugar, cornstarch, stabilizer stuff, anti-clumping stuff, anti-rotting stuff, color, and flavor. And cornstarch is just the refined version of what everyone was getting out of the ground corn in those earliest Indian puddings. Over time, cornmeal has been relegated to the savory side of cookery, so rice pudding, wheat flour, and tapioca pudding took over the space of cooked dairy puddings at home. But cornstarch as a thickener persisted and persists, and the Indian pudding recipe, mostly as nostalgia and a curiosity, continues to exist. The fine cornmeal, molasses, milk, eggs, and spices version is even in the 2006 edition of the Joy of Cooking cookbook. The second 18th century adaptation of corn that became widely adopted was cornmeal puffs or fritters. At this point, sweet fried things existed as a sort of fried dumpling or donut, and it was a convergence of the sweet fried items like wheat flour Dutch donuts and wheat flour batter-dipped spiced apples, or dough concoctions mixed with spice and studded with bits of prunes or dried currants. One puzzle piece that pushed the creation of the American savory fried item was that the need to carefully husband butterfat for frying was removed. The American pig was getting fatter, or lardier, if you will. As a result, there was enough lard to deep fry. The rise of the plantation farm meant hog butchering time would result in 20 or more pigs to salt down and smoke. This meant a large kettle of fat to render. The salt pork industry for the navies, both military and merchant, was also adding to the fat stores on colonial shores. The meat would hit the salt barrels, but large pieces of lard would be held back for home use. Soap making, capping jarred preserves, and deep frying savory foods. The final ingredient that would make the southeastern colonies the eventual home to the hush puppy, which has nothing to do with feeding dogs, by the way, was the arrival of the West Africans, who already had a tradition of frying savory starches in fat. Along the West African coast under the Bight, the oils were plant oils, palm, shea, and varieties of other nuts and seeds. But frying small fish and balls of millet or sorghum flour pastes, plantains, and meat tidbits were already a practice. Access to cornmeal mushes and kettles of lard from the large hog butcherings that resulted from the colonial plantation and seaport structures made the rise of the fritter almost inevitable. Batter coating croquettes, and then fish, and then hot dogs, and eventually mozzarella sticks, and finally Twinkies and beer will all grow out of this 18th century conjunction of cornmeal, lard, and frying expertise. The last item of early 18th century corn-based food that was more or less created by the circumstances of the British North American colonies was distilled corn liquor, or corn whiskey. Moonshine before it was such a thing. When you get right down to it, distilled ethanol liquors are almost unparalleled when it comes to being fungible, that is, being easy to divide, being shelf stable, and being recognized as universally valuable. The thing is, even parched or lye-treated corn is eventually going to probably get wet or get invaded by worms or rats. And even if it doesn't, what is realistically the very best thing you can make from it? Bread? Porridge? Pudding? Each and every one of these things requires ingredients: milk, sugar or molasses, eggs, spices, butter or cream, maybe a fruit topping, some cinnamon, saffron, cloves, allspice, or ginger. Look, no matter what you turn this corn into, it requires fuel. It requires ingredients. It requires one of these legendary, nay, possibly mythical cooks to create something that is transcendent. By the 18th century, the famine dangers of the 17th were pushed to the very edges of society. As a result, there was a pretty hard cap on the value of corn grains. They have a value, but they are bulky, perishable, and in the end have limited utility as a medium for exchange. But what if? What if you could store corn in a way that concentrated the corn calories, protected the nutritional value from rot as well as rats and other crawly vermin? It was a reasonable currency stand-in, and, get this, the longer you stored it, the more valuable it could become. Enter American corn whiskey, the baby temper tantrumy version. In other words, like early beer and early rum, early corn whiskey was, for the most part, pretty raw stuff, but accepted since it was definitely better than nothing. Making grain mashes was an ancient and well-established practice by the colonists. It's how beer is made, and as I've mentioned, corn had once already been made into sorts of beer. As I've also mentioned, Europeans had no love for corn-forward beer. But, as with the terrible molasses beer that can be distilled into rum, terrible corn mash beer was being distilled into corn whiskey. And the fact that it is called corn whiskey was an indication that some of the earliest experimenters with this liquor were Scottish, and they were also living away from the port cities where rum was king. The living far from the ports is an important part of the story. Turning the corn grains into whiskey created a product that was easier to transport. There's a quip regarding corn whiskey that the amount of distilled product one horse could carry had a value equal to what 20 horses could carry in whole corn. And if you work through the math of how much corn would go into, say, 1 gallon or 4 liters of whiskey, the ratio checks out. Along with being easier to transport, it was valuable enough to work as a sort of money. Again, away from the ports, coins were scarce in the colonies. So having something of value that was infinitely divisible, didn't degrade, but was also immediately usable, made corn whiskey and other liquors useful in keeping a barter and trade system going. This concentrated form of corn not only worked as a monetary substitute in colonial internal economics, it also acted as a trade good with the Native Americans, especially when it came to procuring deer hides and furs, which proved to be empire-building raw materials of the New World as well. So here we are. In the 18th century, corn continued to be a builder of empires, but in a new way. Instead of feeding the heart of the empire directly, it became a fuel to feed the edges that sent other riches back to the center. As corn became an important food to these pre-Americans, they changed it into new things that satisfied their desires for items from home. As a result, 3 truly American ways to consume corn were invented in the 18th century and have persisted in evolved forms all the way into the 21st century. Cornstarch and milk-based puddings, savory, deep-fried cornmeal items, and corn whiskey. Corn was definitely an American food now. Corn was fundamentally changed in North America by these transformations. It was no longer appreciated as itself, and vast swaths of the variety that made it so useful and so resilient were lost. As Americans, we are lucky and frankly owe a debt of gratitude that the erasure wasn't more complete, despite the best colonial efforts. Seed keepers that have persisted among the Native American communities over the centuries have preserved some of the diversity. Considering the centuries of cultural dismantling, forced relocation, and attempts to eradicate traditions and languages, this is frankly incredible. Home gardeners and rural farmers who also recognize the importance of seed variety have also kept banks, even if much of the history of the seed origins was lost. Now, renewed interest in plant adaptability is starting to pour more resources into the preservation and rejuvenation of long-ignored varieties. And the DNA plant detective work that I talked about in 17th century corn is allowing a more complete travelogue of corn to be written. Next week, fish returns. I'll look at the glow-up colonial fish got in the 18th century. In the Old World, they were either reviled as food of the poor, badly smoked and salted, or the exclusive perquisite of the wealthy and the monks, tricky, fresh delicacies. But in the New World, where everyone had settled next to a stream or shore. They were plentiful and fresh for all and became an everyday food. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to sign up for Intelligent Speech, and as always, a podcast review is much appreciated to help spread the word. Also, a particular acknowledgement to the podcast Spirit Plate, hosted by Shiloh Maples. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Instagram bio at THOA Food and in the show description.